Hello and welcome. I'm Waxing Philosophical, and I would like to help you become so as well. If you're new to the channel, please like and subscribe if you like the content, and please feel free to come back and check out my other videos or make comments below, especially if you have questions about any of the things that come up in the video. You might recall from the previous video that we spent a good deal of time talking about the foundations of knowledge, what it is, where it comes from. We're going to have to unpack a lot more of that and be more specific about what we mean by some of those concepts. We also talked about truth evaluation. We're going to talk about that again today in a different light. We talked about the difference between opinion and fact, and this important idea of subjectivity. We're going to try and break away from this subjectivity, and we're going to do this by introducing identity and paradox, and contrasting these two ideas with the ideas that we have in a way that we can make rational sense of the world in a concrete way, hopefully. After that, I'm hoping that we can move on to the discussion about a priori synthetic knowledge and how categories work. In this video, I want to keep everything as brief as possible, so we're going to just run through our topics of acquisition, evaluation, identity, paradox, and hopefully make sense of some of these topics. When we're concerned with the process of acquisition, which again we did talk about in the last video, the process of acquisition typically comes from the experiences that we have of the world, and then we make abstractions based on those observations about particular elements of a particular observation. So if we're examining cats, for example, we might notice that this particular cat has claws, has whiskers, has 4 paws, has a tail, and has spots. So we might surmise, or we might make an abstraction based on our observations that all cats have all of these characteristics. Some of this might be true, but not every cat has 4 legs, not every cat has spots. So this is the kind of thing that is going to require a little bit more unpacking, and we'll get to that again in evaluation. But I do want to talk about other forms of acquisition, so far as relation of ideas is a good example. If we're looking at cats, this is something that we can point to in the world that we have access to. If we're talking about an idea like a unicorn, that's not something that we can go to in the world. But what we can do is think about what this idea is supposed to mean. It's a horse with a horn on its head. So we know about horses. We can go to horses in the actual world and make observations and abstractions about the category of what horse is. We also have animals with horns, rhinoceroses or narwhals. So we might take that concept and combine it with horses to form this more complex idea of relation of ideas, which is not based on experience, though it is arguably an experience to combine these ideas. That's a complication that we're going to shelf and talk about probably later. And then a priori synthetic knowledge is also a method of acquisition, but that's where we're going and not where we are. So let's shelve that for the moment too. We do also have this process of evaluation, where like we talked about in our last video, we are trying to determine whether something is truth evaluable, and if it is, whether it is true or false. Now, taking that a step further, we have these ideas of verification and replication. In this process, we are trying to test the observations that we had about this cat with this other cat. So one has calico spots and one has a tuxedo coat. So now we have a different kind of abstraction that we can derive from these two particulars that we found in the world, and the abstraction might lead us to believe that there are two kinds of coloring coats for cats. Upon further observation, more verification, we might come to understand that there's a whole complex possibility of different coats that cats might have, right? And this is something that we do with verification over time. We also have replication. This is more of a scientific process, like we saw in our last video with epistemy. This is something that we test, and this is something that we verify through demonstration. So we might combine vinegar and baking soda, see that there's a reaction, and then test this over and over again as many times until we're convinced that this is going to be a consistent phenomenon that we can count on in the world. There is a caveat to be had here that we'll get to when we introduce Hume later on, but it's another idea we're going to shelve for later. These ideas roughly give us what we might consider correspondence, where ideas correspond with states of affairs in the world. And we can have relative confidence about there being correspondence, what that means, and what we gain so far as truth value. We can contrast this idea with correspondence with some of the stuff that we talked about in our last video, and compare it to traditions, compare it to other ways of thinking and other people's traditions and other people's observations about the world to help us get a better, more concrete idea. But what we're really going to be focused on when we're trying to come up with these concrete ideas is what it means to be essential property of something's identity. When we're talking about something which is essential, it can't not have it, or it's no longer that identical thing. It has become something else, has crossed a threshold like we talked about before. When we're talking about these kinds of properties, it's what a thing must have to remain as itself. And to better understand how we know for sure that something can or cannot have certain kinds of properties before the identity changes, we might try and use this idea of paradox to come up with limits or exclusions, negations for something, what something must be. If we have particulars in the world that we can observe, like cats, then we have something pretty tangible, pretty concrete that we can rely on. If we're talking about something that we can't come to know through our direct experience, how do we come to know anything about that? Well, let's use this example of God in general. How is it that we come to know what God is, or how do we define this? You might be familiar with the phrase at the top, I am that I am. This is considered one of the most reasonable explanations for how to think about God, because if you look at the second thing here, the second bullet point, God equals, and whatever you put on the other side of that, all-powerful, all-knowing, in all of these other adjectives that we might come up with, all of them are going to be insufficient for what that definition is. We can list every word in human knowledge and would still not quite capture what this idea is, or have a better idea of how to define it. But what we can do is we can set limits on what a thing must be by excluding what necessarily cannot be the case about it. If we say, well, God is good, so that means that God can't be bad. So let's fill in this. That's if it's both, that's a paradox. It can't be both good and bad. So we have a little shaded area over here where we can say, okay, this is something which can't possibly be the case. But that's not sufficient. God also has to be perfect. Which means that nothing about God can be imperfect. We have this whole shaded area over here, which excludes whole possibilities of reality. God isn't in any particular time. God is in all times. not being in any particular time gives us another large shaded area of exclusion, what must not be the case. And because God is all-knowing, it means that God can't learn anything new from moment to moment. God always knows all of the things. And so these kinds of exclusions about what cannot be true, possibly without creating these paradoxical ideas, gives us kind of a shaded idea of what something is if we can't hold it, if we can't touch it, if we can't see it. When we don't have access to concrete information, we can use our rational ability to exclude huge ideas from what the identity of that thing is, or what that identity means. So when we're considering this idea of paradox, it does a good job of setting limits and helps us define the identity. We're going to talk about this relationship a little bit more when we're trying to distinguish the difference between inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning, because most of what we have discussed today involves inductive reasoning, and a little bit of deductive reasoning, and telling the difference between these two is very important for understanding how it is that we come to understand a priori synthetic knowledge, and how we come to understand the limits of what can be known, and how it is that we know things, and how it is that we know that those things are true. But I hope that you have enjoyed this video. Again, if you have any questions, please make comments below. It really helps me out to have interactions on the YouTube page. Also helps me build content if I have questions, if I have some curious minds who are setting me off in a good direction. So I hope you all have an excellent week. Thank you.